Hey y'all, welcome to the first episode of Midwestern Gossip. Yeah, so we are here today with owner of Wellness with Ashantis LLC and 2023's Chicago's Best Personal Trainer nominee, Ashantis Jones. Ashantis is a dynamic and passionate intersectional wellness educator and consultant with experience in business and consulting, personal training, and mental health advocacy. Ashantis has worked with brands like the New York Times and Teen Vogue to advocate for health and wellness for all. Welcome, Ashantis.
Hi.
So here at Midwestern Gossip, we want to talk about, what's going on around the region. There's so much happening in the Midwest, especially in the last 5 years. We've seen a boom of economic growth in cities all across the region, as well as folks moving into more creative spaces. We see folks, taking, like you, taking this intersectional approach to health and wellness in a way that we haven't quite seen other folks do before here. So let's start off with, just tell me a little bit about yourself, how you are connected to the Midwest, and a little more about what you do.
Yes, so I am a Midwest girl through and through. I am born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, and that is where I spent the first 18 years of my life. And after that, I decided to move to Chicago, which is where I currently am based. And I have been here since 2012. I came here for my undergrad. I went to DePaul University, and I had my BFA in theater management. And then I actually went back to DePaul and I got my master's of education in counseling. And so being able to be the first guest on Midwestern Gossip is a very high honor, because I live and die as a Midwestern girl, even though I am a Black person that has certainly felt, the anti-Blackness that does still exist within the Midwest, and regardless still feels so connected to pieces of this culture and into my Blackness and my Black American identity in particular, but also just really understanding that there is a certain connectedness that we get to have as Midwesterners that does not exist in other parts of the US. And I appreciate that, even when it's come with the things that are not as good. But I really got into this space because before I came to Chicago, I started teaching Zumba with my mom the summer before college. And it was just something to do because I think she was sick of me always making comments about the YMCA's their choreography. And she's like, if you don't like it, do it yourself. And we found out it wasn't that hard to do it ourselves. So we started teaching Zumba at I don't know, $5 a class in our church basement that summer before. And it really was just a way to make money. And I never thought that I'd have a career in fitness. I did my things in theater. I enjoyed that time, but then realized I would never make any money because I was working for one of the top theater companies in the world and making no money, and was like, oh gosh, there's not really a huge up from here. And so I decided to get my master's degree in counseling and clinical mental health and college counseling and student affairs. And really at that time was going through my own personal body image and eating disorder struggles. And so decided that's what I wanted to specialize in to support, other young folks, but in particular, other Black folks with their feeding and eating disorders, because I realized that there are not a lot of clinicians of color in this work, and certainly not a lot of Black clinicians doing this work, even though eating disorders do, in fact, impact folks that are living in Black bodies, that are living in small bodies, tall bodies, fat bodies, disabled bodies, right? There's so much intersectionality in that work. And I think that is what pulled me back into fitness, and why I decided to also become a certified personal trainer. And so I work now as a therapist with folks helping them understand how to live in this world and the intersectionality of all of the different identities that they hold. And then I'm doing similar work as a trainer as well, but really focusing on the ways in which folks talk about their bodies and the ways in which that impacts the way that they move their bodies, but then also being able to understand that movement, like talk therapy, are both so crucial in being able to understand and process the world we live in. So yeah, that's that's the TLDR. Oh, it looks like you're muted on
So,
my end.
so I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the things you mentioned. So the first thing is I heard you say feeding and eating disorders. Now, I haven't, for the most part, when I hear about this, group of disorders, I've only heard the eating disorder. So would you mind talking a little bit more about that and why that phrasing is important to use?
Yeah, absolutely. So, eating disorders are, from the clinical standpoint, very interesting the way that we speak and talk about them. So, if you look at it from just the way that they were spoken about in my master's program, for instance, we spoke about eating disorders in our chemical dependency class. And so, mental health wise, disorder wise, feeding and eating disorders usually have similar treatment models to chemical dependency. So something similar to a drug addiction or alcohol, but also very similar to other behavioral addictions like gambling or sex, for instance. And so I prefer the phrasing of feeding and eating disorders because, number one, it is just truly more accurate because one of the multiple different types of eating disorders you can have is pica, for instance. And so pica is a feeding disorder in which a lot of times, in particular in children, they will be attracted to eating things that are not necessarily edible. And so what ends up happening as far as the treatment for that particular feeding disorder is that we try to find edible foods that match the textural sensation that is oftentimes what folks are, and they're kids, so they don't really fully even understand this, right? They don't have like that brain development yet, but they're like, I like the texture of sand, so I'm going to eat it. But it's not safe for kids to eat sand. So we're trying to find something that's actually edible for them to eat that allows them to have that similar textural sensation. This can also come up in diagnosis like ARFID, for instance, which is quite common in neurodivergent folks and more particularly in autistic folks. And this is when sometimes just certain textures do not vibe. And I personally definitely had ARFID as a kid, and I would go through these phases of only eating certain things, and then it was like in my endless, and then it was not. So for instance, pickles, I got in trouble for eating pickles straight out of the jar as a kid. That is how much I was obsessed with pickles. Ask me the last time I ate a pickle out of the jar. I don't know. It's been that long. It was probably in the 90s, if I'm being completely honest. And that's because I essentially had my life's allotment, if you will, of pickles in a very small period of time as a child. And then once it hit a threshold, I had the ick for it, and I quite literally will not eat it if it's the last thing on earth. So that is part of the reason that I think it's important to, just speaking about those two feeding disorders. But then I also think that for a lot of people who have experienced food insecurity, a lot of times they end up picking up similar patterns to eating disorders like anorexia, like binge eating disorder, for instance. And what will end up happening a lot of times is folks will internalize a lot of guilt and shame about the way in which they are attracted to food or to certain foods. But the reality is if you are somebody who wasn't sure when you're going to get your next meal, it makes sense for you to, from a survival standpoint, utilize what would, from the DSM-5 criteria, which is how we all diagnose folks, look and be utilizing similar behaviors that are found within folks with anorexia nervosa, for instance. However, in your case, you're trying to limit and silence your hunger cues, not necessarily because you are worried about your body size changing, which is one of the specific criteria for anorexia, but more so because you're trying to be able to survive knowing that your body needs food, but you do not have access to food at this time. So I just personally love speaking about these things in the nuanced and complex way that they deserve. And yeah, that's kind of that.
Yeah, no, I love to hear that as somebody who has experienced food insecurity as well as also felt the social pressures of existing in a larger body and especially existing in a larger Black body in a predominantly white
Mhm.
community. I grew up in a small town about an hour or more outside of St. Louis, Missouri on the Illinois side. And my family, was one of the only Black families in the community. And going through school, I remember going through like this fifth grade, like the state physical health test or, whatever we used to have to do.
Yeah.
And we had to weigh ourselves, like we literally just got in a line and stepped on a scale. And I remember finding out that I was the heaviest girl in the grade. And this is like fifth grade. So this is like peak. The boys are bullies and, you're starting to learn about yourself and really feeling self-conscious and everything. And it has taken, a long time to really undo a lot of the lessons that I was taught growing up, especially also like just digging through all of this stuff surrounding food and what our bodies should look like that come from, society or our families, while also looking at that intersection of race and of the different expectations that my community had for my body compared to the the other friends that I had or the other girls that I was in
Hmm.
class with. And
Yes.
right now we're really seeing this rise of conservative fashion and the phrase then is in is being thrown around a lot. Earlier I also heard you talking about how working with these feeding and eating disorders looks different than um, it looks different in white folks versus Black folks or how white folks versus
Hmm.
Black folks are treated. Do you want to talk a
Hmm.
little bit more about that?
Yeah, because I think that generally speaking, most most people, when you ask them about their general understanding of eating disorders, and you ask them to maybe say, like, visually speaking, what does this person look like? A lot of times it's going to be a white person. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. Number one, because I believe that the ways in which eating disorders were in some ways introduced to people through the weight loss industry, the purpose is to keep you hungry, because if you're hungry, you can't really use your brain. And if you can't really use your brain, you're pretty susceptible to being okay with things like fascism. So it's actually very helpful to keep people hungry when there is some type of power struggle. And so I think that, in particular, that eating disorders were introduced to white women in a hopes of keeping them tamed in their whiteness and not creating what would have been truly intersectional feminism through the feminist movement, right? Um, but I also think that, again, because there are these very specific criteria that exist within the DSM under all of these disorders that would typically not allow people of color to be included, there is also this idea that eating disorders really only impact white people because that's who we've researched. We do not research feeding and eating disorders in other communities because, frankly, most people do not care to fund the research of non-white communities. And that's something that happens across medicine, right? That's not even in particular to feeding and eating disorders or addiction, or chemical dependency at large. That is across the spectrum. And so I think it's just really important to acknowledge, because quite often people are internalizing what they believe are just them not having willpower or them not being disciplined enough. And the reality is there's actually a lot of complexities underneath that speaking with a practitioner, whether that be a mental health provider, whether that be a dietitian, whether that be a fitness professional, because I think that all three are very integral to the feeding and eating disorder treatment process, that they have to also be looking at it from this intersectional lens, because if you flatten it, it doesn't allow the complexity that it deserves, right? And so when people speak about, well, I don't necessarily feel this intense need to eat, but I also think about this one time where my family didn't have enough money, and so when we did go to the buffet to eat, we ate a lot, and the kind of thought that that would tide us over to the next time that we had the financial means, right? So now as an adult, when you're going through the binge eating disorder treatment process, for instance, if we don't take into account that piece of your lived experience, we're really flattening what's at play and what's taking place. And I think overall within the mental health field, there is this flattening that often takes place. And that is because of the ways in which I think Western psychology is really a lot of times used more so in a way to have control over people, more so than actually helping people heal. But that's my beef for another day.
Yes, we might have to come back and do a whole nother episode because, yeah, I hard agree with that one. And within all of this, so, something that I've been learning about as I've been reading more into like prison abolitionist, work and things like that is really realizing how punitive of a society we really are, even in
Mhm.
everyday interactions with others, with our loved ones, and with ourselves. And when we're talking about
Mhm.
food specifically, there's so much messaging around food being a reward, around food
Mhm.
being good or bad.
Mhm.
And yeah, like it's just really difficult to break out of that mindset to see food as just food. We'll hear messages, counter messages like, food is fuel for your body, fuel is energy, food is, some food is good for your heart, some food is good for your brain, different things like that.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that, definitely plays into this idea that, food is used as a source of control in so many different
Mhm.
ways, and especially considering the current political environment that we're in right now, when we're seeing so many folks struggle to access food, whether it's because they live in a food desert, whether it's because they don't have, financial means to access food, and the quality of our food is not
Mhm.
as it once was.
Yeah, and I think that because there are all of these different things at play, it becomes difficult to have conversations about what are major food companies putting in our foods. And like there is actually space, I think, for us to have conversations about what is this additive that Kellogg's has decided to put in all of their cereals? Is the purpose of this additive to promote the way in which we process the nutrients that's in this food? Okay, I'm like cool with that, right? Versus, is the purpose of this additive to make me want to buy more of this product, that I'm not cool with. And food engineers, I think over the last decade in particular, especially in the rise of like social media and podcasts, have started to be a little bit more honest about the fact that there are certain food companies that are talking to their food engineers and are saying, okay, make this product, but also can you like add a little something, something to it to make people want to come back and buy more? Because at the end of the day, in a capitalistic society, you're going to do whatever it takes in order to make sure you're on top because you're going to be rewarded for it monetarily. But in a society that does not reward capital in that same way, you have no reason to want to make the cereal, quote unquote, more addictive. And I feel like it's difficult to have those types of conversations right now because we can't even get people to the place where they understand that cereal is a neutral food. And so it just becomes very like convoluted. But I think there's something to be said about the fact that a lot of major food brands take advantage of the ways in which a lot of our food policy is written.
And speaking about food in the context of addiction and thinking about the just current environment that we're living in, like take Illinois for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have things like marijuana is legalized, and
Mm-hmm.
then gambling is legalized. And then we have these people putting different things, with our food policy, moving our food policy around, and our food is becoming more addictive. And you think about all of these different things that's also happening in our communities, even speaking to other types of addiction, substance use is a huge concern in rural communities, especially when
Mm-hmm.
we also then lack access to, healthcare and other social services to support folks to either prevent,
Yes.
or, to manage and treat substance use disorder afterwards. And it's a very scary tunnel to kind of look down sometimes because of course even with bringing up marijuana legalization, I that is something that I definitely support. We could go down the rabbit hole there, but it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting to think about what things are kind of past when, and what's the bigger picture there, seeing these other things happen, in line in the greater context of what we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, I think that's so important to discuss because the reality is, especially when you want to talk about cannabis, right? The only reason that we're starting to see recreational legalization now in the US is not because everyone all of a sudden has just truly had a change of heart. It's because white people were like, wait a minute, we could find out a way to make money legally this way. And it could be a lot of money. And we don't have to include the people who have been harmed the most by our policies to not allow this thing to occur. And I say this because when I was at the Forbes 30 Under 30 Summit in Cleveland a couple of years ago, there was a panel that had, a woman from Edie Parker and Dutchie, and they're talking about their products and the innovations within the marijuana and cannabis space, but you want to make innovations for a reason because it lines your wallet, right? It's really, yes, it is actually very cool for you to have this little purse that has a lighter attached to it. I'm not saying I don't want it, but at the same time, you're not working to get people who are incarcerated for having a dime bag. Like, what are we really talking about here? And so knowing that capitalism is the thing that truly drives much of American policy, we do have to ask ourselves what's really going on and what's the big picture. Because at the same time we're having these conversations about cannabis, we're also having conversations about Ozempic being wildly available for people to use as a weight loss method. But then Now, folks that needed to use it for its original creation, which is diabetes, don't have access to their medicine. And so, do we say sorry to the disabled diabetic that you can't have your medicine because everyone is trying to achieve thinness so that they can possibly be spared in whatever is to come? Like, what is the conversation we're really having here, friends?
Yeah, and let's talk about weight loss for a second because you brought up a really important point. Chronic illness is the leading cause of death in many states. In Illinois, heart disease is a leading cause of death. We have, very high diabetes and prediabetes prevalence rates. 1 in 3 adults in Illinois either have prediabetes or diabetes. Um, and so whenever we're looking at treating that, and folks are, and let me just talk from my own personal experience. I was pre-diabetic at the age of 15, and I knew that all I knew, I guess, at the time was that, like, okay, well, you get that from eating sugar, and I need to just stop eating sugar. And I have struggled with my, weight and body image and looking at it in those terms as I've gotten older and as I've
Mm-hmm.
looked at more of these like justice led and intersectional led movements and understanding how that affects even our individual health, right? And feeling
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, I know I want to, especially at this point in my life and in doing this work, like I know that I want to be able to move my body in ways that feel good, but I still feel like whenever my weight does trend up, that this like fear that immediately means that I am unhealthy. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like, and how do we balance all of those things?
Yeah, the thing I like to tell people is that I think that when we speak about health, we have to first really define what it is that we're speaking about. And so when I speak about health as an intersectional wellness educator, I am talking about social determinants of health first. And whenever anyone, whether they have an MD, whether they are a therapist like me, they are another fitness professional, are, in some other um, healthcare or healthcare adjacent profession, whenever they're like, well, this is what people need to do to be healthy, I'm like, okay, but what about social determinants of health? Because the reality is we know, we have studied and have been able to understand that at the end of the day, an individual has maybe up to 30% of the ability to control their health status at any point in their life. And 30% is minuscule in the grand scheme of things. And so when we're talking about, well, people need to eat better, okay, what is better? You're saying people need to have more nutrient density, right, in their day-to-day diet. Okay, well, without us looking at social determinants of health and realizing that redlining exists, or that just generally we have the inability to not look at this at a multifaceted lens, we're not even really having the same conversation to start. And when we speak about social determinants of health, that's us talking about what is the education that somebody has access to, what is the healthcare somebody has access to, what is the ability of safety somebody has access to, right? The idea that you can tell people, well, everybody can exercise, just go for a walk. You do realize there are certain neighborhoods that quite literally don't have sidewalks, or there are certain neighborhoods where it is not safe to necessarily take a walk around the block, because if you turn left versus right, that's the difference between you quite literally catching strays. So we're using big generalized health advice and then making a lot of people feel guilt and shame and internalize the fact that they are pre-diabetic, diabetic, have high cholesterol, etc. And they're like, well, this is my fault. And the reality is it your fault or is it the fault of the fact that your government, whether that be your city, state, county, etc., doesn't care or does not have the people in power that want to make sure that resources that would increase your social determinants of health are available to you, right? Because there's always going to be a difference between the folks that have the ability to not only afford fresh fruits and vegetables, but that have access to get them. There are some people who may be able to afford fresh fruits and vegetables, but they do not have a store near them that is close enough for them to go and get them. So that is something they simply do not have access to, or that access comes with a giant expense. So that's like one piece of the pie. And then I think the other piece of the pie is that we talk about, or let me rephrase it this way. There are things that are pathologized in our current day that frankly never should have been pathologized. And one of those things is fatness. And so what I mean by that is a lot of times when we talk about body size, folks will say, well, we have an obesity problem in America. And the reality is obesity is measured by the BMI. The BMI is not a scientifically accurate measurement. And so there's nothing else that we really utilize within modern day science that has come from before that we've proven is incorrect, but we still just use it anyways. And the big piece of that is because if we no longer pathologize fatness, people would lose their money, right? Because the weight loss industry globally makes over $70 billion a year. Like per year, and that number has continued to increase, and I'm sure the 2025 number is probably going to be over 100 billion just because there's so many more folks that are actively wanting to intentionally lose weight. And the reality is I understand why people want to intentionally lose weight. There's a point in my life where I wanted to intentionally lose weight, but what I have understand now is that so much of that is not necessarily tied to what would be best for my health, but rather it is tied to what would be best for the society that I currently live in. And so I do not personally, as a provider, I do not support people with intentional weight loss because there is this slippery slope of ending up with a mental health disorder like an eating disorder, which is quite deadly. But I also do not fault people for wanting to lose weight because the reality is fat people do not have access the same way as non-fat people. But fatness was only pathologized because blackness was pathologized. If colonialism never existed, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation in more ways than one.
Yeah, that is, I mean, there's just so many great points there. I don't even know where I want to take us forward because yeah, just the pathology of blackness and how that relates to different body types. You know, one thing I know we were talking about is, you know, thinking of the accepted body types in different areas. And here in the Midwest, you know, what people are going to think the um perfect female form looks like is different than what that looks like down south or in the west or even in the east. You know, and but either any region, you know, is going to be a comparison to what a black body looks like. Whenever folks really start talking about it and they really start explaining why they have certain preferences, and I'll put that in quotes, heavy quotes, why folks have certain preferences for, you know, one type versus another. And, you know, being here in the Midwest, it is an interesting place to be a person socialized as a girl and a woman, and especially also
Mm-hmm.
when you do exist in a black body, because girlhood and womanhood is not always something that has historically been afforded to us. And
Yeah.
even now, the way that that looks and the way that we are able to interact with that is also very, very different. Who, you know, who's allowed in there by definition. And
Mm-hmm.
I think in the Midwest, especially it being from a rural community in the Midwest, on one hand, the idea of hard work is praised and being able to,
Mm-hmm.
go out and provide for your family. But then on the other hand, there is still this ideal around thinness and,
Yeah.
being able to present in a certain way. And for me, I always felt such a struggle between those things of wanting to be strong enough to help throw hay bales, but also then, at home
Mm-hmm.
and then going to school and being like, oh no, but I want to be, you know, super skinny to fit in, with the girls and what they, think is cool. So yeah, so when you're talking about control, when it comes to food and even our body image and things, it's on that level of chemistry about how our brain works and how we need food to function.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also this whole other lane of being so caught up in body politics and what it all means that if we're spending so much of our time and so much of our money, because like you said, this is a high earning industry that is continuing to grow, then they have control of us in more ways than we even realize.
Yes. And I think that that is one of the reasons that intersectionality has become so important to me and now is so central in the work that I do. And I, bless Kimberly for letting us know what was going on. Thank you, Ms. Crenshaw, because the reality is when I was going through my own eating disorder recovery process, I would think like, I've hit the finish line. I finally have understood all the things about why I did that. And then another layer would need to get peeled back because actually it touches on your queerness. Actually, it touches on your blackness. Actually, it touches on the fact that I am a Midwesterner, right? But like I am also only truly a second generation Midwesterner. That's not where my family roots come from. My mom's side of the family is originally from the Georgia and West Virginia areas, and my dad's side of the family is originally from Alabama. So even, speaking about like, what does that even look like, right? For the fact that both of my parents were first generation Midwesterners. So you've taken all of these values from your Black Southern identity, which is a very specific identity, I think, within the Black American diaspora, if you will. And now it's being integrated with the North. And, in the Midwest, especially I think in Ohio, we constantly get clowned for like y'all put mayonnaise and everything and y'all put, jello and everything and whatever. And like I can't necessarily say that my family puts mayo and everything. I personally don't really eat mayonnaise even. But there is also something to be said, right? Because the reality is at every family holiday there is a 7-layer salad. And that certainly does have mayonnaise in it. So I don't know. It's just very interesting to like when you allow the thing to be complex and nuanced, how much more you take out of it and realizing that's actually where the community occurs, is us being able to understand that though we have lived so different lives, we also have lived so many similar experiences as well. And what can we learn from sharing those perspectives with each other?
Yeah, and I think another really great point you brought up is how queerness intersects into this conversation as well. I was just having a conversation with my older sister, and my older sister and her friend actually, we went out I was in the band in high school, and after a football
Period.
game, they had they had taken me to Denny's. It's like there
Yeah.
was no place really open out here, so we had to go to the next town over and went to Denny's. And I was sitting there and I was like, so I'm in my senior year, right? And I was like, hey y'all, there's something I really need to tell you. And it honestly wasn't even anything that was actually that important. And they both looked at each other and they were like, "Oh, we knew it. You're a lesbian." Like they're literally over here like shaking hands, like winning bets. And I was like, "What are y'all even talking about?" And for me at
Mm-hmm.
that point in time, I I think that I've always known my sexuality, but because it wasn't talked about, because most of the representations of queerness I seen were white. And the
Mm-hmm.
folks that were, in my family, are in my black side of my family, they there wasn't anyone that I seen that was queer. They didn't talk about queerness at
Mhm.
all unless it was in a negative way. So I was kind of, we kind of laughed the moment off, and I put it, kind of in the back of my head, and didn't really think about it. And it wasn't until I was able to get into college and I was able to see more folks, and know more folks, and learn, like, no, this is a space that is carved out for me.
Mhm.
That I am allowed to be in, and that I can be loved in as well.
Mhm.
I was so with all that being said, I was recently having a conversation with my older sister, and she was like, again, kind of, she's like, well, I don't know how anybody didn't know. Like, you always kind of dress like a drag king or drag queen. We have
Mm.
folks like we have Chappell Roan right now, who has been very popular. She's from Missouri, and bringing out this idea that even people who just the different types of folks who can participate in different types of
Mhm.
spaces, and different things. And it was just interesting because, thinking back to it, I knew that this should have tipped me off. I used to sneak and watch RuPaul's Drag Race, and I was in love
Mhm.
with it. And it was like one of the only, gay things that you could find on TV that we would get that would,
Yep.
come in out on my mom's farm. And I definitely did emulate that style of makeup and dress, and wanting to do just all the things. And folks
Mhm.
just, and so when I think about how I've always wanted to present my body and my interactions, and how I feel about my body, and how that is rooted in queerness, but how that's also something that is kind of forced to be invisible in rural spaces,
Mhm.
that folks don't feel comfortable having conversations more out in the open about it.
Mhm.
And folks, there's so many folks that'll say, like, oh, well, I don't understand it. It's not that you don't. There's nothing to understand or not understand. You just don't
Mhm.
want to see it. Let's just call it what it is,
Right.
you know. And then how that, because even whenever I felt insecure about my larger body, even whenever I felt like I wanted to lose weight intentionally, I still had such a confidence and walked around with so much power, within myself. And
Mhm.
I was this, tall and curvaceous and all of these different things. And that made so many folks around me feel uncomfortable. And especially
Mhm.
now that I am older and I am, comfortable and open with my queerness, that makes even more folks uncomfortable, walking around
Yes.
town.
Yes. And I think that to be completely honest with you, I feel like I have really been able to deepen my queer identity, if you will, by also deepening my Black identity. And I think that is because there is so much similarity, especially in the Black American context, of the ways in which Blackness and queerness intersect, and that they are very fluid with each other. And I think that there is something. I think that it is very interesting that so many of the people that I perceive to be the greats, if you will, such as like a James Baldwin, also is Black and queer. And I think it's because when you are queer, you understand how much is thrust upon us in an effort to keep us in compliance versus in an effort to allow us to be who we are. And what I mean by that is something as simple as oh my goodness, like Kendrick Lamar choosing to wear the bell bottoms, okay, at the Super Bowl performance, right? I personally, as a Black queer woman who does not believe that the binary should exist within fashion, and regardless of what somebody's sexuality is or how people perceive their sexuality, I think fashion is for everybody. And that, like, if somebody who said they were a straight man was walking around in a skirt, like, I really would not think anything of it, because the garment is the garment and it's all about, the unique sense of style that people put into it. But I think that that also comes from a place where I understand that, like, truly everyone is queer, and that, like, if we're really being real, queer, I think, has always been the default of humanity. And from a sociological, even from a I can't say it. Looking at it from an anthropology y'all know what I'm trying to say,
Yeah,
standpoint.
right. No, I
Queerness
get you.
has
I get you.
always existed. It has always existed. We didn't need to be in this binary, right? There are people who lived and have always lived outside of boy, girl, male, female, right? Like even the idea, right, where people say like, oh, well, gender or sex is just biology. Actually, no, it's not, because intersex people quite literally exist. So what are you talking about? And have always existed and will always exist, right? There is a reason that a seahorse is carrying the male is carrying the pregnancy, because we've created this very specific rule in our head that it must be this way, in the same way that we've created these rules around what is blackness and what is not blackness. And so now you got people, you know, oh, you're not really black because your one parent is black but the other parent is not, or oh, you're not really black because you grew up in this part of America versus not, or oh, you're not really black even though you are, right? And so I think that like blackness and queerness both live in this similar place of, it's always, somebody is always trying to put it in a box. And in general, our society is always trying to put us in a box, and we want it to be perfect and stacked. And the reality is, a lot of us trying to push each other into these silos is why we have the issues that we have right now, because y'all aren't allowing people to just be people.
Yeah, and I can't remember who said it, the quote, but it was effectively like, to white folks, blackness is inherently queer. They don't necessarily see a difference. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's very interesting, especially because even though growing up I did dress and act, in such a way, it was never seen as queer. It was just seen as, well, she's black, so she's different anyway. Like
Mm-hmm.
we don't understand it, but we don't understand blackness, so we're just gonna put that, in this box over here, and we're not gonna
Yes.
interrogate that any further. And that's so, it's just, yeah, it's so interesting to me how, we also, unfortunately, there are so many folks that they do not allow themselves to fully experience themselves. As you said,
Mm-hmm.
queerness, I also believe queerness is the default. But then when we also look about who really makes up the Midwest, and when you really understand, the mindset of folks in the Midwest,
Mm-hmm.
thinking all the way back even centuries ago, whenever the United States was first, being colonized, the folks that they were sending to do that, sending out west and to expand their hold and their control on the area. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
times it was folks who had strong affiliations with, or when you're looking at the leaders and stuff of folks, strong affiliations with the state, but also very strong religious ties. So a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
folks that have moved out this way, I know we typically think of like the Southern Bible Belt, but the Midwest has a very strong,
Mm-hmm.
Puritan, religious mindset within it. And
Yes.
because of that, that is where a lot of this, especially when it comes to like queerness and being set in these quote unquote like norms and binaries and different things, a lot of that comes from there. And we also know how religion was also used historically as a tool of oppression to be able to control Black folks. And to control, just different groups of people, and to strip people from their identities, and to
Mm-hmm.
give them a Christian identity that was created by these men, as opposed to, whatever was written thousands of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it all just plays into each other.
It really does. And I think that, again, that's the beauty of these types of conversations, is that we do get to see how so many of these different problems that we're all facing are actually mirrors to each other. And that, like, you can't have a conversation about capitalism without having a conversation about race. You can't have a conversation about race without having a conversation about fatness, because anti-fatness exists because of anti-blackness. You can't have a conversation about fatness without having a conversation about ability and disability and ableism. You can't have a conversation about ableism without having a conversation about quite literally anything else, because ableism is a lot of the reasons that we've ended up where we are. And all of these things make up pillars of white supremacy. And white supremacy at this point in this day and age is not something that only white people can push and progress forward. Quite literally, many of us are agents of white supremacy. And so I see so much of my work as the ability to help people realize they don't have to continue to be an agent of white supremacy. And not to say that they will or won't be, right? There is no perfect. That is another kind of layer of it, right? We are like, it's 100% this way, it's 100% that way. Again, you're putting things into a binary that quite literally don't actually even exist within the binary. And society or nature at large has proven this time and time again, except we keep trying to put it into, the circle in the square peg, if you will. And yeah, it's just like everything's connected. So you and that's why I think that it's so important that I do the work that I do in focusing on body image, because I was not thinking about these things until that recovery process. Did I know prior to my eating disorder and that recovery process that I was feeling certain types of ways about my body size and about my race and about even being able to claim my queerness? Yes, but it wasn't until I went through the recovery process that I was able to really deepen some of those understandings and understand why I felt so much internal conflict, and then was able to understand that what was being internalized as conflict actually wasn't even my cross to bear, if you will. That was just the way in which I was understanding the world that I live in and the things that I have access to in the body that I have. And that is really a lot of the work that most people are doing on their day to day.
Yeah, all of that. Because it's really difficult for folks to challenge these beliefs that you had. Like, I like how you just said that it was you were operating in the world. I'm gonna mess it up, but I like how you said that you don't have to be operating in the world the way that you were taught, and we can unpack these things, we can challenge them,
Mm-hmm.
and we can live in a way that really is comfortable and aligned with who we are, and things that make us feel good, and that benefit,
Mm-hmm.
everyone around us.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, because the reality is if you are living truly in your alignment and in your truth, then you're not spending a large amount of your limited battery, right? All of us have a battery every day, whether we want to believe it or not. What we eat, how much we sleep, where we live, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is going to determine what our capacity, what our battery level is each day. And the reality is when you're living in alignment, it's not that you don't have problems. I still have plenty of problems. But what I understand now is that those problems are not necessarily all of my creation, and that some of them are simply the way in which I have to interact within the world that does not prioritize the ability for people to just be housed, fed, provided with medical care, and understanding that the people who do not currently share the similar belief of believing that food is a human right, that clothing is a human right, that housing is a human right, and that fundamentally no one should be born into this world trying to figure out where they're going to get their next meal when we have enough food on the globe to feed everybody tenfold. Like that is how we progress. That is how we continue to move forward. Without agitation, you are going to just keep getting the same thing over and over and over again. And the reality is what we currently live in, it does not work for most people. It only works to support a very small amount of people. And what is the purpose of us hanging out here after, the asteroids killed the dinosaurs if all of us are going to be miserable for no reason?
Right, absolutely. No, I feel that. Well, Shantis, you have done so much in your career already, and I do thank you so much for the work that you're doing and the perspective, that you're bringing to the work. Now, look, I'm 28. I'm going on 29. Now, you don't have to share your age, but I'm knocking on 30's door. And it
Hmm.
is actually very relieving for me because, there's this idea that your 20s are so great. And I think that there's so much pressure put on your 20s to be excellent, especially when you're younger and you're in college and you've
Hmm.
got to be the star in college to go on and be the star in your career. But yeah, I'm relieved to kind of be at this point where it's like whatever I've done is in my 20s, is done, and I get to kind of sail into my 30s and kind of be the expert in my own life. Um, you
Hmm.
know, but how do you feel about that as we are kind of
Yeah.
starting to like move into this next stage, of our lives, do you feel a sense of excitement? Are you dreading it? How
Mm,
are you feeling?
yeah, so I'm 30 already. I'll be turning 31 in a couple of months and in May. And I just a couple of days ago actually turned to my partner who is 37 and said, "Uh, so I'm gonna be 31 on my birthday?" And he said, "Yeah, that's how that works." And I was like, "Oh, okay," because not 10 years ago, I assumed by the time that I was 31, I would be married, that I would have a certain amount of money in my bank account, that I would have children, that I would be in a house that I own, right? There are all these things that I assumed would happen by the time I turned 30, and now I'm turning 31, and so many of those things have not occurred already. And a large part of me assuming some of those things would happen is because those were things that my parents were able to accomplish by this age. But the reality is, my parents were born in the 70s, and what they were dealing with in their 30s is not the same thing as what we're currently dealing with as we enter our 30s or continue through our 30s, right? The world is a very different place that in some ways has afforded us a lot more ability to be ourselves, but in many other ways has taken away a lot of our ability to truly be our full selves. So I really had to take this step back, I think, to say where I am is where I am right now. And I really, in general, try to stay as present as possible, which is a skill. I was for many years of my life always a future oriented person. And I think that's because that's a lot of how we're raised to be, right? They ask you in first grade, what do you want to be when you grow up? So from 6 years old to 18, I was trying to figure out, well, what the hell do I want to be when I grow up so that I could figure out what to go to college for and what will make me money and da 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 da. So, yeah, it's so complex. It's so nuanced, but I feel excited. I think about the fact that I am about to be 31 and I have done a lot of wonderful things already in my career, but that I'm only about to be 31 and I still have a long life ahead of me and I still have so much more to learn. And that through those lessons, I'll hopefully be able to support other people as they continue to learn and grow through life.
That was really beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. Well, we are
Yeah.
coming to the end of our time, so I want to give you one more shout out. Thank you so much, Ashantis. Where can people find you to follow you? Do you have anything coming up? What do you have going on?
Yes, so if folks want to follow me, they can. I'm all over the internet with the same handle. I am Ashantis. And for folks that are like, Ashantis, how do you spell that? Ashanti with an S on the end. It's very simple, and I know everybody know how to spell Ashanti. So, or at least every Black American definitely does.
Right.
Um, y'all know who Ashanti is. What? So yeah, you can find me at I am Ashantis everywhere on the internet. And I'm having similar conversations like these within the various communities. But if you want to work with me, I teach on a virtual weight inclusive group membership called Level Up, and we have an app in the App Store, or you can just hang out with us online. And then we have folks that join us from all over the world, which is really cool. And you can do it in the comfort of your home, just like, over a little Zoom. So I always tell people that's a primary way that they can really interact with me no matter where you live in the globe, and that we'll have a fun time in our interaction together. And I'm very blessed to have my co-teacher on that, Lauren Lavelle. It's her membership. She brought me in. But yeah, those are the fun places you can find me on the internet. I don't have any big things per se that have already been fully announced yet, but you can always check out my website, AshantisJones.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Ashantis. This has been a super great conversation. And y'all remember to like and subscribe and share. So yeah, you get the word out about Midwestern gossip. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.